What happens when the country that once controlled the road between Asia and Europe wakes up and finds a new road growing around it? And what if the nation helping build that road is not Russia's enemy first, but Russia's own most important partner? Before we go deeper, do this for me. If you like sharp stories about power, trade, and the hidden moves behind world politics, tap like, subscribe, and share this video with one friend who loves big geopolitical shifts. For a very long time, Russia had something no speech could fake and no army had to explain. It had position. If goods wanted to move over land from China to Europe, the easiest path usually ran through Russian space or through networks Russia could influence. That meant money, leverage, and quiet pressure. It meant Moscow was not just a country on the map, it was a gate. Now that gate is still standing, but traders, governments, and investors are starting to walk around it. A route is rising across Central Asia and the Caspian Sea, then through the Caucasus and Turkey, and into Europe. It is often called the Middle Corridor. It links China to Kazakhstan by rail, crosses Kazakhstan to the Caspian, goes by sea to Azerbaijan, then by rail through Georgia, and from there toward Europe through Turkey or across the Black Sea. That sounds technical, but the meaning is simple. The more this route works, the less Russia can act like the unavoidable bridge between East and West. This is not just about containers, ports, and train timetables. It is about power. It is about who gets paid, who gets bypassed, who becomes important, and who learns that geography is not destiny if enough money and fear are poured into an alternative. For Russia, this trend is dangerous because one of its oldest strengths has always been the map itself. For Kazakhstan, it is a chance to turn location into independence. For China, it is a hedge. For Europe, it is a backup plan that is becoming more attractive each year. And for the countries in the middle, this is their moment to stop being a corridor on someone else's terms and start acting like owners of a route the world needs. To understand why this feels so dramatic, we need to step back. There was a time when Central Asia sat at the center of the old Silk Road. Caravans moved goods, ideas, religions, and technologies across the landmass. Then sea power changed the world. Shipping became cheaper, larger, and more efficient. Trade moved to the oceans. Ports became the kings of exchange, and many inland routes lost the magic they once had. But history has a strange habit. Old roads can return when the new ones become risky. That is exactly what is happening now. The modern global economy was built on the belief that goods would move smoothly through the cheapest routes available. Companies wanted speed, scale, and low cost. Governments wanted stable supply chains. For years, many of those assumptions held, but then the world started throwing shocks at that system one after another. First came the slow change in thinking after Russia's earlier aggression against Ukraine. Then came the full-scale invasion in 2022, which turned routes tied to Russia into financial and political risk. The Northern Corridor became a liability for many Western countries after the invasion, and traffic shifted toward the Middle Corridor. Then came wider supply chain anxieties and shipping disruptions, including security threats around the route to the Suez Canal through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. In other words, the idea of depending on one road, one choke point, or one political relationship started to look reckless. When people talk about trade corridors, they often make them sound boring. But trade corridors are really emergency exits. You do not fully value the second door until smoke starts filling the room. The middle corridor did not suddenly become attractive because it was perfect. It became attractive because the older choices looked less safe. And once that shift in psychology began, money followed. Recent growth on the route has been strong. Cargo across the Caspian section of the corridor surged in 2024, even though it still remained far below the capacity associated with Russia's northern route. That is the point. The real story is not that the new route has already won. The real story is momentum. Trade routes become powerful not only because of where they are today, but because of what investors believe they can become tomorrow. That belief is now changing the map, and no country sits more directly at the heart of that change than Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is in a difficult, almost uncomfortable position. It shares a very long border with Russia. It has deep economic links with Russia. It cannot simply slam the door on Moscow, and pretend geography disappeared. But it also understands something that the war in Ukraine made impossible to ignore. If your future depends too heavily on a stronger neighbor, then your economy can become a hostage to somebody else's conflict, sanctions, decisions, and ambitions. So Kazakhstan has been trying to do something very hard. Not a clean break, not a dramatic rebellion. A controlled escape from overdependence. That is why the rise of the Middle Corridor matters so much for Astana. This route gives Kazakhstan a chance to become more than a buffer, more than an exporter of raw materials, more than a space between bigger powers. If trains, ports, logistics zones, customs systems, and industrial facilities expand around this corridor, Kazakhstan can move up the ladder. It can earn transit fees, attract factories, increase political importance, and negotiate from a stronger position with every major power around it. That last part is critical. Small and medium powers do not gain freedom by becoming isolated. They gain freedom by becoming useful to multiple sides at the same time. Kazakhstan seems to understand that deeply. It wants ties with China, but not submission. It wants working relations with Russia, but not control. It wants investment from Europe, but not dependency. It wants Western technology, Chinese demand, Turkish connectivity, and regional influence all at once. That balancing act is difficult, but the corridor gives it physical infrastructure to support that political strategy. And this is where the story becomes painful for Moscow, because the more successful Kazakhstan becomes at building links westward that do not require Russian territory, the more one of Russia's silent advantages begins to weaken. For centuries, Russia benefited from a form of strategic gravity. Countries around it had to take Moscow into account because too many routes, pipelines, markets, and military realities passed through Russian space or near Russian control. But the Middle Corridor chips away at that logic piece by piece, steadily. A rail line here, a port expansion there, a new customs agreement, better digital paperwork, more ships, faster border processing, a bigger role for Turkey, more European financing, more Chinese cargo. Every single improvement says the same thing. Russia is still important, but maybe it is no longer unavoidable. And once unavoidable starts turning into optional, power begins to leak away. That does not mean Russia is suddenly finished as a transit giant. Far from it. The Middle Corridor still handles only a small share of the capacity associated with the Northern Corridor. The route also faces coordination problems, port constraints, maritime weaknesses, rail issues, border delays, and poor data exchange. So no serious analysis should pretend this new route has already crushed the old one. But that is not the real threat to Russia anyway. The real threat is not immediate replacement, it is long-term erosion. Empires and great powers often lose influence in two ways. One is dramatic defeat, the other is quieter. An alternative appears. Then another, then another. Suddenly neighbors do not need to obey as much. Partners bargain harder, investors diversify. Revenue trickles elsewhere. The old center remains large, but it is no longer the only game in town. That is the kind of danger the Kremlin should fear here. And there is an even harsher twist. The country helping make this bypass route more valuable is China. Think about that for a second. Russia has leaned heavily toward China since its rupture with the West deepened. China is the partner Moscow needs for trade, energy demand, diplomatic cover, and economic breathing room. Yet China does not view the world through Russian emotion. China views the world through Chinese flexibility. If Beijing can use Russian routes, it will. If it can use Central Asian routes, it will. If it can build multiple paths to Europe and reduce risk, it will do that too. China does not want one door. China wants every door. That is why the Middle Corridor appeals to Beijing. It offers an additional westbound connection. It gives China more room to move. It lowers the danger of over-reliance on any single country, any single sanctions environment, or any single political crisis. Even if the route is not the cheapest on every shipment, it has strategic value. It increases options. And in global competition, options are power. If this analysis is helping you see the map differently, here is your checkpoint. Hit like if you are still with me. Subscribe if you want more deep stories told simply. And share this video with someone who thinks trade routes are boring, because this is really a story about who gets cornered and who finds a way out. China's behavior in energy tells a similar story. Russia badly wants to redirect lost European energy revenue toward Asia, especially China. Power of Siberia too matters, because it could help Russia replace major lost export capacity with a projected design capacity of 50 billion cubic meters per year. But China has leverage. It has other sources of gas, including LNG and pipeline supplies from Central Asia. That means Beijing can negotiate hard. Russia needs the deal more than China does. That imbalance matters beyond energy. It tells us something important about the wider relationship. Moscow may want to imagine a great strategic partnership of equals, but in practical terms, China often holds more patience, more optionality, and more bargaining power. The middle corridor fits that pattern perfectly. Beijing can support routes that help Kazakhstan and others reduce reliance on Russia while still doing business with Russia where useful. That is a humiliating reality if you are sitting in the Kremlin, because it means your most important partner is not protecting your gatekeeper role. It is quietly adjusting to a world in which that role becomes less central. Now let's shift westward, because Kazakhstan is not the whole picture. A corridor is only as strong as the chain of countries that keep it moving. After the Caspian crossing, Azerbaijan and Georgia become essential. Then Turkey becomes the hinge between Asia and Europe. Turkey's role is especially important because it is not just a piece of land at the edge of the route. It is a connector with ambition. Rail links through the South Caucasus give Turkey a bigger position in east-west trade, and because Turkey already sees itself as a bridge between regions, this corridor supports a story Ankara likes to tell about itself, that it is not a side player, but a central platform between markets, cultures, and strategic theaters. Europe sees value in that too. For the European Union, the middle corridor is not simply about getting Chinese goods faster. It is about de-risking. The route fits Europe's effort to diversify critical mineral and energy supply chains and reduce dependence on Russian transit. Central Asia's rare earths and other critical materials make the route geopolitically valuable for both economic and defense reasons. That point is huge. This corridor is not rising in a vacuum. It is rising in an age when industrial policy, green technology, batteries, defense production, and strategic minerals all matter more than before. Europe wants access to uranium, copper, tungsten, titanium, and other resources without feeling trapped by Moscow. Central Asian states want more routes to more buyers. The middle corridor offers both sides a reason to invest. That is how infrastructure becomes strategy. A track is never just a track. A port is never just a port. A customs agreement is never just paperwork. These are physical expressions of trust, fear, hedging, and future planning. But before we get carried away, we have to ask the hard question. Can this route actually deliver on the hype? This is where the story gets more complicated, and honestly more interesting, because the middle corridor has real weaknesses, serious ones. The biggest problem is that a route on the map is not the same as a route that works smoothly in real life. Better railways help, bigger ports help, more investment helps. But if the corridor stays slow, confusing, and unpredictable, companies will not trust it with critical flows. One major choke point is the Caspian Sea. Cargo has to cross water between Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. That means ferries, port timing, vessel availability, weather, and water levels all matter. The Caspian has been shrinking in recent years. Lower water means operational problems, pressure on ports, and harder conditions for shipping. If the water keeps falling, the route's central crossing gets weaker right where it most needs reliability. That is not a minor inconvenience. That is a structural problem. Then there is Georgia. Georgia matters because it is one of the key western links of the corridor, but major infrastructure there remains constrained. Existing ports are under pressure, and the Anaklia deep-sea port project has struggled to move forward at the speed supporters hope for. In plain English, one of the corridor's most important exit zones still lacks the scale and certainty needed for a true breakout. And there is another problem people often ignore because it sounds less dramatic than war or sanctions. Coordination. Trade corridors do not fail only because bridges collapse or seas shrink. They fail because paperwork is slow, agencies do not cooperate, schedules do not match, Tariffs are confusing, wagons wait too long, and nobody controls the full route from start to finish. If goods move fast on one section and then sit idle at the next, the whole promise of the corridor starts to fade. So, yes, this road can bypass Russia, but bypassing Russia is not the same thing as becoming smooth, cheap, predictable, and dominant, because hype creates headlines, but logistics decides winners. Still, even with all those flaws, the route continues to attract attention. Why? Because global strategy is rarely about finding a perfect option. It is about building a good enough alternative before the old system becomes too risky. That is why the middle corridor is moving from idea to necessity. Not necessity for every shipment, not necessity for every company, but necessity for states and firms that have learned the cost of overdependence. And this brings us back to Russia. The deeper issue for Putin is not simply lost transit revenue. It is the collapse of a dream Russia has carried for generations, the dream of being the indispensable land power at the center of Eurasia. That dream depends on more than military force. It depends on relevance. It depends on neighbors believing that whatever happens, they still need to route trade, energy, diplomacy, and security through Moscow's orbit. Once countries begin designing systems that reduce that need, the dream starts to thin out. And the cruelest part is that Russia cannot fully stop this without paying an even greater cost. If Moscow pressures Kazakhstan too hard, it pushes Astana to diversify faster. If it pressures Georgia, Azerbaijan, or Turkey, it confirms the fear that Russia uses geography as leverage. If it complains about China's role, it risks exposing how dependent Russia itself has become on Beijing. That is the trap. Russia can dislike the bypass. It can warn against it. It can try to complicate parts of the regional environment, but it cannot easily reverse the central logic driving the corridor's rise, because that logic was created by the very insecurity Russia helped produce. When a country teaches its neighbors that dependence is dangerous, those neighbors eventually spend serious money to escape. And that is what we are watching now. A slow geopolitical migration from dependence to diversification. Not total freedom, not perfect balance, but movement. There is also a deeper lesson here about middle powers. People often assume the future belongs only to giants like the United States, China, or Russia. But many of the most important geopolitical stories are really about countries in between. Countries that are not superpowers, but are smart enough to turn location into leverage. Countries that know survival in a dangerous neighborhood depends on having more than one friend, more than one market, more than one rail line, more than one investor. Kazakhstan is trying to play exactly that game. And in a strange way, so is the wider corridor itself. The route is not a monument to one empire. It is an attempt to build a network where no single power owns every switch. That does not mean power disappears. China will still be huge. Europe will still bring money and standards. Turkey will still seek influence. Russia will still matter because of geography, energy, and force. But the shape of power changes when a network becomes more distributed. That is why this corridor feels so symbolic. It suggests a Eurasia that is less vertically controlled and more competitively connected. For countries in Central Asia, that could be a historic opening. Outside demand for the region's critical minerals creates a window of opportunity. If these states use that moment well, they can build local processing, industrial capacity, skills, and stronger links to multiple markets. If they fail, they may simply remain exporters of raw materials while others capture most of the value. That is the fork in the road. One model says a country extracts raw material, ships it out, stays dependent, and hopes transit fees are enough. The other says a country uses the corridor as a spine for factories, services, finance, technology transfer, and domestic industry. The first model keeps you useful. The second can make you stronger. Kazakhstan and its neighbors now have a chance to choose, and Europe has a choice too. If Europe really wants strategic autonomy, it cannot just announce big ideas and then lose focus. It has to help solve the boring problems that decide whether corridors live or die. Port financing, customs integration, data systems, rail compatibility, long-term investment, insurance, and political patience. Big speeches do not move containers. Systems do. China understands that. China funds, builds, and plans with hard infrastructure in mind. That is one reason Beijing stays so influential across Eurasia. It does not only talk about routes, Europe is now trying to prove it can think that way too, and the United States is watching the same space with growing interest, especially where critical minerals and strategic competition with both Russia and China overlap. The route is becoming part of a much wider contest over the future shape of Eurasia. If you want a second signal that this channel is worth riding with, here is my ask. Subscribe before the final stretch, drop a comment with the one country you think benefits most from this route, and share this video in your group chat with the person who always says maps never change. They do, quietly, then all at once. So who wins if this route keeps growing? Kazakhstan wins if it stays stable and keeps balancing carefully. Turkey wins if it strengthens its role as a gateway and connector. Azerbaijan and Georgia can win if they deepen infrastructure and keep the western leg functioning. Europe wins if diversification becomes real rather than rhetorical. China wins if it gains yet another route without having to choose only one. And Russia? Russia does not disappear from the map. It remains too large, too armed, too connected, and too geographically central for that. But it risks losing something psychologically and strategically profound. It risks losing the habit other states had of assuming there was no serious alternative to passing through its orbit. That is not a small loss. That is a change in how Eurasia thinks. And changes in thinking are where geopolitical earthquakes begin. Because once investors, officials, and logistics companies start assuming alternatives will exist, they plan accordingly. Capital follows expectation. Infrastructure follows capital. Influence follows infrastructure. And suddenly, what once looked permanent begins to look negotiable. This is why Putin's dream is under pressure. Not because one new train erased Russia overnight. Not because one port expansion ended centuries of geography. But because a new logic has entered the system. The logic of redundancy. The logic that no state should be allowed to monopolize movement across an entire continent. That idea alone changes behavior. And behavior, over time, changes maps. So when you hear that China, Kazakhstan, the Caucasus, Turkey, Europe, and global institutions are all investing attention into this route, do not reduce it to a shipping story. This is a struggle over who defines connection in the 21st century. Will Eurasia remain organized around old centers of control, or will it become a region with more doors, more bargaining space, and more middle powers refusing to stay trapped? That is the real stakes of the middle corridor. And that is why Russia should worry even if the corridor never fully replaces the northern route or sea shipping. It does not have to replace everything to change everything. It only has to become credible enough to weaken fear. Because once countries realize they have somewhere else to go, they negotiate differently, they invest differently, they obey less. And when that begins, the old bridge does not collapse in one dramatic blast. It is simply no longer the only bridge that matters. So here is the final image I want to leave with you. Imagine Eurasia as a giant system of gates. For years, one gate stood above the rest, powerful, profitable, and hard to avoid. Now engineers, bankers, governments, and strategists are building another path beside it. The old gate is still there. It still carries weight. But each rail upgrade, each port investment, each customs fix, and each new shipment tells the same quiet story. The age of one unavoidable route is ending. And for a power that built part of its modern identity on being the land bridge between worlds, that may be the most dangerous shift of all. If this video gave you a clearer view of the map behind the headlines, make this last move count. Like the video to push it farther. Subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive, and share it with someone who wants geopolitics explained without the noise. Because the next battle for power may not begin with missiles. It may begin with a railway line no empire can control. That is why this story is bigger than cargo. It is about who gets bypassed, who adapts, and who realizes too late that the world moved while they were still staring at the old road.